Welcome to the Lydia and Spin with Lydia Lunch and Tim Dahl. Tonight our guest is Chris Campion, somebody I've known since the early 80s when he used to accompany me to my early spoken word shows in the UK. Chris went on to work for record companies, became a journalist writing about weird Japanese pop culture industry, girl groups, black metal, and then started covering all kinds of diverse subjects, written for very many magazines. He wrote for The Guardian, Time, Rolling Stone, etc. But I think my favorite piece of journalism, at least until now, was his, as it's called, the anti-biography of The Police, Walking on the Moon, the untold story of the Police and the rise of new wave rock. And yes, I do mean that hideous group, The Police. It's one of the funniest rock books I've ever read. You will absolutely wet yourself while reading it. I didn't know hate could be so beautiful. Welcome, Chris Campion. You're listening to the Lydia and Spin with Tim Dahl, and we're talking to Chris Campion. Fantastic journalist, writer of books, historian, digging up the dirt on everyone you want to know that you didn't even know you knew you wanted to know about it. There we go.
Yeah, so what I want to know, first of all, how the fuck did you two meet? I mean, you're a fan of hers? Did you approach her? Did she approach you?
No, I was working in an office, and it was a record company that was putting out one of Lydia's spoken word records, and she corralled me to come and sell merch for her on tour.
Oh!
He was my bag boy, as I like to say. He would come on the train with me to small towns like Portsmouth.
Well, that's one consistent nod of approval from Lydia after, touring with her for the last 5 years is if she puts you to work, that means she kind of likes you.
That's much as true.
She's got so much to do.
It's not like I had a choice, really.
Well, there's that, but she's
or
got so
a
much
job to do otherwise.
Well, she doesn't have a choice but to be working all the time because she's a one-man machine, and basically she wants to hang out with you. You got to work because she's doing shit all the time.
I want to pay you, but I'm sure I didn't even have the money to. I
don't remember that. Yeah, it was a long time ago. I was 23 or 4 or something like that.
Amazing.
You've known me for half your life.
Yeah. At least.
And so, of course, Lydia, we're by the way, we're here in Joshua Tree, California, and a very beautiful morning/noon. I don't know what it is, but it's gorgeous.
Desert location.
Yeah, we're outside. In fact, we're lucky enough to be outside. And so, Lydia, when did you realize he's living in the desert again, or how did that?
Well, I mean, that's a big stretch from going to Portsmouth.
I know, but we're out here. But
I don't know when he moved to the desert. I don't know the trajectory. I mean, Chris and I have met in many places over many years. He needs to tell me.
Well, yeah, that's what I know. So how did you make it to the States, and why are you here now?
Okay. I'll keep it as brief as possible.
You don't have to.
I guess, the reason I came to the desert was I was working on a story. It was about a science fiction movie that Graham Parsons shot out at a UFO convention in 1969. It's sort of the origin story why Graham Parsons came out here. It was a story I just kind of stumbled on.
Okay.
So I came out to the desert and just kind of fell in love with the place and stayed here.
Really. And could you paraphrase Graham Parsons' theory on UFOs? I know nothing about this.
The Joshua Tree's always been a sort of a big UFO center.
Okay,
right.
And the desert
so
is.
From the 50s, yeah.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
So there was a guy. There's a place called Giant Rock that's about 20 odd miles from here.
Yep.
That's like the largest freestanding boulder in the world apparently, and it was used as an airport and.
Military airport? Or
no, just a civilian airport.
Okay.
And it was run by a guy called George Van Tassel, who in some point in the 50s had a UFO contactee experience was given a mission by Venusians to spread the word of, what interplanetary science and philosophy and everything like that. And he built a building out there near the rock called the Integratron, which was intended as... When it was finished, it was going to be a time machine to basically revitalize human soul, human body, whatever. So from the 1950s onwards, George Van Tassel was holding UFO conventions or meets for people like him and any other kind of interested parties in UFOs and aliens and spaceships. that was like, there were 11,000, 15,000 people coming out to this rock in the middle of nowhere, driving out in their cars, their camper vans, everything. It was in the 50s.
Yeah.
And so I guess in LA, and people had sort of heard about these meets, you know, it's sort of known in the counterculture there.
Yep.
And I guess Graham Parsons came out with a whole bunch of other people, and they started making a documentary during one of the UFO conventions. It was Graham, Michelle Phillips, Doug Trumbull, who did the special effects for 2001.
Oh, my God.
And Julian Jones, who was Brian Jones's 5-year-old son.
Okay.
And his mother, Linda Leach. And they were all brought there by a guy called Tony Fouts, who's the guy that told me the story about the sci-fi movie. He was the writer-director. And so he had brought them all out there to start making this film, and it turned into this sort of pretty weird sci-fi movie that it got lost, basically. It was filmed, and then the footage disappeared, and the story sort of disappeared. Somebody had told me about it, and I contacted Tony.
Amazing.
Well, again, and what's interesting about this story is that so much of these podcasts, so many of them, it's about this connective tissue, like how one person leads to another, and you just mentioned Michelle Phillips.
Right.
Who then you went on to spend the last 8 years investigating the true story behind Papa John Phillips.
Right. Well, this story about Graham came out of that research for that book. You know, I would just, you know, I was working on the John Phillips story. Yeah, and I would just, you know, someone would mention something to me, and I'd look it up or follow that thread, and
so,
you know, following the crumbs to all these different places.
And we're talking about Papa John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas, who I consider to be the origin of the dirty hippie movement. I think basically he might have been not single-handedly responsible, but him and probably Charles Manson really helped to kill the Summer of Love. And
invented it at the same time.
Invented it and killed it in the same breath.
It was always the same thing, I guess.
One thing that I found fascinating, because I did like the Papa John Phillips book, Papa John, which I thought was very revelatory. I mean, he really admits quite a lot, but you dug a bit deeper. But two of the facts that I found most interesting, John and Michelle Phillips took over the Monterey Pop Festival.
Right.
Which is amazing, because from the Monterey Pop Festival and Woodstock at the same time came all the other festivals.
Right.
And they had the insight or the criminality to take that over. The other fact I found fascinating in his book is that Roman Polanski thought that John Phillips murdered Sharon Tate.
And held a knife to his throat to force him to admit that.
The thing that blew my mind...
Which he couldn't really, because he didn't.
Is that he was having an affair with Mia Farrow, and he actually stood up to Sinatra,
right?
Who sent over thugs. He's like, fuck off.
You're talking about Roman Polanski.
No, I'm talking about
John Phillips.
Phillips.
Yeah, he had an affair with Mia while Mia had just, I think right after she'd separated with Sinatra. So.
But he still sent over thugs, right? To kind of he was jealous still.
Then back to Roman Polanski, who directed Rosemary's Baby. So again, the connective the threads. I mean, this is a mosaic of crocheted bloodlines.
The last, I've been working on this book on and off for a period of years, but it's led me into all these different places and different other stories that have sort of sustained me in the meantime.
Tell us a little about the cock-blocking of the finalization of the research into Papa John Phillips, because 8 years or more is a long time to work on a project that has yet to come to fruition. Is there really that much dirt to dig?
Well, I mean, there's a pretty expansive story there, and I had to find all the information, because he had his own memoir, but it's not like he was in the public eye. He was in the public eye, but he was sort of in the wilderness. He was not it's not like you're doing a Rolling Stones biography and you can call up 5,000 articles, and so I had to track all the people down and find the material that I needed. So that took a long time, and then I would just get distracted and go off and do other things. And, it's kind of a labor of love that sort of generated all these...
hate.
Well, I don't know. It's still a labor of love. I haven't lost interest in it, even so.
Yeah. But that's what's amazing. And this is such dirty hippie fashion. Somehow he's competent enough to hijack festivals, get all his money from the industry, and then incompetent at the same time. He's fucking up. It's
doing more drugs than Keith Richards.
I don't know about that. Really? John he's one of the sharpest of his generation of musicians. He was a businessman and he was an artist. He was way sharp. I mean, he got screwed over like everybody got screwed over at that time, but he was a lot sharper than a lot of these guys. He was a lot better read. He was a lot better connected. You know, he was a step above. But the thing that is just huge distance he fell from being at the height of fame to just going all the way down into this sort of like depravity and probably the you know, the most debauched, you know, hellish existence you can imagine.
Well, pool tables littered with pills from one side to the other at the parties, for instance.
Well,
I mean, that's a great detail.
Well, also, you know, the drug, he was a junkie for 5 years, but that 5 years was pretty extraordinary because, you know, he jumped in with both feet and he had managed to work out a way to, basically there was a scheme that sort of became part of where he was getting blank scripts from his drug dealers. And he had a pharmacy in Midtown Manhattan that would bring in the blank scripts with a shopping list. They would give him a shopping bag full of drugs. He would go back to his dealer and he would get high-grade cocaine. I think cocaine was mostly his thing.
Was that also when he was doing drugs with one of the Kennedy sons?
Yeah. He had all of these.
How do you fucking? Like, what favors? Like, why would someone just give him this?
The FBI.
How do you? Someone doesn't just give you that, or maybe he was cool enough. People want to hang out and just give it to him.
This was just drug exchange. This was just
Like so he had he knew the Kennedy kids. He knew. I think the Maytag, the son of the Maytag Corporation, all of these sort of scions of American industry and politics, right? He was hanging out with in Manhattan, and they would go to Papa John's house.
What year was this?
Late 70s, yeah. All of these guys, Bobby Kennedy Jr., Christopher Kennedy Lawford, the Maytag guys, they would all go to Papa John's house because, one, it's Papa John, right? It wasn't that far off the Mamas and the Papas, and he was still cool and hanging out with Keith Richards. And all of that. And then at the same time, it was better than buying off the street. You get the best shit from Papa John. You know, and that's why they all, Christopher Kennedy Lawford, I think, in his book says the only Caucasian I ever bought drugs off was Papa John Phillips.
That's funny. And as a musician, it kind of breaks my heart. And I always say this, I'm like, God, if I hated music, I could do much better in the music thing. And it's kind of like, this guy has a level of clear brilliance to some level, the way he connects with humans, the way he positions himself, the way he manipulates things.
He's a grand hustler.
And I'm always thinking, like, when she should put that effort into music. Personally, that's my own thing. Like, what about
the aborted record that he did with Keith Richards? I mean, did that ever come out? His recordings?
It came out.
It did
eventually,
come out.
a couple of different times.
Was it any good?
It's amazing. I mean, the stories behind it are almost better than the actual.
Used well.
But it was basically. I mean, the money that supported that record was supposed to be his comeback. It stalled because it was kind of a failure originally.
I mean, it never came out at the time because the sessions were so.
Just drug sessions, basically.
Yeah, basically. I mean,
the meter was running. These are high. Well, and then
Mick Jagger and Keith Richards were producing the record and also appearing on it. And then at some point, the Stones organization just realized that this is a black hole that we're all going to.
Was too much even for Keith Richards.
Yeah. I mean, so when I hear these stories, and I think of another maniac, Dennis Hopper, essentially blacklisted because he was just a fucking nightmare after tremendous independent success. But then eventually he had his comeback and people let him back in and he was kind of died okay.
But not to mention his affair with Michelle Phillips. Again.
Exactly. Yeah.
Another tissue that connects. Who was Michelle Phillips? I mean, at one point she was having affairs with Warren Beatty, Dennis Hopper, who else? Like there was like a handful.
Jack Nicholson.
Oh, the finest.
So the whole crew.
Only the finest maniacs.
Yeah, someone told
she had really good taste in men, huh?
She split up from John in '69. She basically went through John's male friends, and one of John's best friends said to him at the time, "She's fucking them to fuck you."
Yeah.
Well, that's a thing.
I like the story about Michelle Phillips. That I don't know if you were able to dig any deeper into this. That's in Papa John's book.
I know what you're going to say.
Yeah, the Black Dahlia connection. Right. The story goes, Michelle Phillips, teenager, girlfriend across the street, kind of takes her in to groom her. And eventually what happens is her dad, the girlfriend's dad, was a doctor and had this photo room or this room that Man Ray and various other photographers would come to. Years later, the brother of her best friend writes a book claiming his dad was the Black Dahlia killer.
Right, this is Tamar Hodel, who was Michelle's best friend when she was 15 or 16 and kind of her mentor and took her around jazz clubs and all sorts of things like that. And Tamar was kind of a tearaway.
And what year was this? Was this like 67?
I'm not entirely sure when Michelle met her, but I know she and Tamar were living up in San Francisco in 61 when she first met John Phillips. And the best part of that is that the way that John and Michelle hooked up was that Tamar and Michelle were living together, and Tamar basically attempted suicide. John basically had to come in with Scott McKenzie and kind of clean up the situation and get Michelle out of the way so she wasn't going to get busted because she was underage at the time.
So this was before the mid-60s, that Black Dahlia.
Oh, no, it was 61.
Okay.
Yeah, that was 61. Michelle tells, I think there's there's a Vanity Fair article where she's telling stories about meeting George Hodel later on.
The supposed Black Dahlia
The supposed
killer.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure what to make about the George Hodel.
Still a mystery.
So I mean, pretty much agreed upon that there was incest going on.
You'll have to read the book.
Okay.
I don't
Which
want
one?
to be at
Yours? When is it coming out?
But, the only thing I would say is that there's a lot more to the story. And
it could not have been easy being John Phillips' daughter, Mackenzie.
The other thing I would say
friend.
is that John's publishing company was called Honest John Publishing, and and honestly, I've had access to tapes of him talking, and he was very honest. He owned a lot.
He owned up to a lot in his book.
Yeah, and actually, when that was ghostwritten, but even on the tapes that were used, the interview tapes that were used to make that book, he owns up to even more, really, in a lot of ways. He paid the price because basically after his little scheme with the pharmacy, he got busted in 1980. He got busted for distribution and trafficking of narcotics. He was 45 years old. He was going to face 45 years in jail.
Holy shit.
And he was a felon for the rest of his life. He was a convicted felon. And, I found the cards where he was still touring later in life with the reconstituted Mamas and the Papas.
John Phillips does the Mamas and the Papas. It's like penned as that or something like that. Or do you own the rights to the name, the Mamas and the Papas?
He ended up sort of just reconstituting the group around himself.
Who was the last woman he was living with?
But what I was going to say was that I found all of the cards that if he would go into Las Vegas or Reno or somewhere like that, he had to register at the police station, take a piss test.
What a pain in the ass.
So he had to carry around the identity card that said that he was a convicted felon. And I think that really that was brutal.
Yeah.
For someone like him.
Well, you're not going to get into Canada very easily.
Who was the last woman he lived with? Geraldine?
His widow lives in Palm Springs. She's an Iranian lady.
Who was the one he was living with? I think maybe somewhere outside of New York, maybe on Long Island.
Genevieve.
Genevieve.
Yeah, Genevieve Waite. That's Bijou Phillips' mother.
Genevieve Waite. And when they left the house, right, when he was, I think, finally busted, they still years later were finding hypodermics in every crack and crevice in the walls. I mean, for years they kept digging up hypodermics.
All right, so we can go back to John Phillips. So let's talk about your trajectory, your beginning as a writer, your investigations into pop culture.
How'd you go from being my bag boy to being a great writer?
So you have this. You started out writing about boy-girl bands from Japan or boy-girl bands in general?
I started out doing music journalism, but I was never really sort of that particularly satisfied with doing that.
Right.
And it just sort of stretched out into other areas and just things that were of interest to me.
Of course.
Whether it was art or any kind of story that would just sort of grab my interest, I'd sort of pursue.
Right.
It's sort of, I went to interview Joe Coleman in 1998, and he was somebody that I've always been fascinated with, and I started sort of pursuing other stories at that point, and as we were talking about earlier, just following one thread to another thread to another thread, something that would take my notice. And so, I've been pretty fortunate, I think, in the kind of stories I've been able to do.
Well, you're curious enough, clearly, to dig up the stuff that most people are lazy about.
You were living in London at that point. I mean, when did you leave London? I mean, you were
at
working
about 2004. All
right.
I left London.
Well, I really liked that story you wrote that you resent me about the what was it called, dogging?
The dogging, yeah, that was.
Give a little insight into that.
Okay, so I was working for this car magazine. For some reason, I ended up doing 2 stories about cars and sex. I don't know why they gave me those stories, but I did, and I didn't say no. And the first one was about drive-through prostitution parks in the Netherlands.
vending machines for sex.
Yeah, it was combining shopping and fucking.
Right.
They were sort of like designed solutions to contain prostitution and specifically sort of like drug addicted prostitutes and
Roadhead.
Like and it just sort of turned into a logistical nightmare, and they eventually had to shut these things down.
But I'd also think that the clientele get excited by picking up a prostitute off the street to jump in the car and jump out. Kills it a bit. I mean, maybe it's not my thing, but
kills it for who?
You drive like a drive-in McDonald's.
I think it's very convenient.
Well, I think so, but if you go to,
I think for the right person, there could be nothing better than just drive by, pick up, get head, pay, drop off. I don't know.
What I'm getting at is that was
everybody wins.
That was a thing before it was a legalized commodified thing. Right. So going into the Holland Tunnel, in the classic shots in the 80s. People in bumper traffic that's not moving, there'd be women in fake minks with thongs just jumping out of every car when you drive 1 foot every half hour.
The great thing about that kind of sex is most men only need about 2 minutes. Well, and if you're making say $50 for 2 minutes, it's not a bad trade, really, in my opinion. I don't know. I mean, that's just
anyhow. Well, yeah, exactly. I think the black market seems to be more successful than when they actually had a legal solution, which sounds like it was a train wreck.
They were a design solution to sort of like, contain these things away from the city center.
There was too much action in the red light district.
But I just want to know what politicians are like coming to the table like, we need to do something about Roadhead because it's not working out the way it is.
Too much traffic jams in street. I mean, Amsterdam itself. I mean, if you're not on a bike, you're not going to get anywhere. The traffic is so bad. And then you got sex tourism. Most people are on foot.
Oh God.
All right.
I mean, yeah, the Netherlands to me, it's such a frat boy. That tourism is just so gross.
Well, I think it was sort of it's related to the Puritanism of Dutch culture as well.
It's like, don't enjoy yourself too much, so everyone, sign the paper.
And the conflict between the liberalism and the Puritanism.
I want to jump from sex to hatred.
Okay.
Meaning your book about the band I hate the most and the book I laugh the most at,
I gotta read
which was your book about the Police. That is the group, The Police.
Right.
What was the title of that?
It was cool. I think it was called Walking on the Moon, but I originally wanted to call it Fuck the Police, obviously.
Of course.
Well, yeah,
and eventually it will come out as Fuck the Police.
Oh, fantastic.
And Sting
tell
won't
us
have
a little bit about
it.
that, because that book was just, I literally laughed on every page.
That was just...
It was the most joyous thing I'd ever read.
It was, occasionally I've been sort of suggested things to do, and that was something that I had an agent at the time who said, if you write this book, I can sell it. And I was like, okay, funny. I'll do that.
Who doesn't need money? A writer getting paid?
So it wasn't your idea. He came to you with the idea.
Yeah, it was just, and I was like, I really fucking hate the Police.
Oh, so you ran with it.
But I ran with it, but I didn't really want to do it. But, once I'd agreed to do it and the book was sold and to a publisher, I had to write it. And it was just excruciating from beginning to end. And
one of my favorite reads, because I was just on the floor. I mean, literally, I think I almost wet my pants one time laughing so hard.
I think I wanted to ruin them for everybody. That was the point.
But didn't they ruin themselves?
They were
true, but I think that needed to be said out loud.
Also, what I liked about it is that it put it in perspective of the time period in culture and politics in Britain at that time. So it's not just about the police; it is about really the culture that surrounded them, which somehow they were outside of it all because they were so fluffy, homogenized.
Right, a lot of it. I mean, part of the book was about like the shift from punk to new wave to something that was very political to something that was completely apolitical, and it was related also to the opportunism of the police and the Copeland brothers.
Totally.
The Copeland family's background in the CIA and
the record label was called
IRS.
Hello.
And not just the CIA. The father was the godfather of the CIA. He was the CIA before the CIA.
Yeah, he was in the OSS. He was one of the most significant figures in the CIA.
And I don't know if you can confirm this theory, but I always wonder, it's like, how did that band become the biggest band in the world in 5 years? And I'm wondering, it's like, because you have the Cold War and you basically have capitalism, you have consumption, and it's basically the way I always interpret it is like a boy band, basically three blonde boys. Even though the guitarist was 10 years older and played with the Animals and all that stuff, it seems like they had a little assistance.
Do you ever just want to vomit while writing it? Probably every day.
Yeah, it was.
You said it was excruciating.
It was excruciating. I'm going to make an admission. I didn't listen to the music.
Yeah, all right. Why would you want to?
I made a choice at the beginning.
You need to hear Roxanne again or Walking on the Moon. I don't think so.
But I did dissect the records and I dissected Sting, and I think I did a fairly good job trying to sort of show who the person was behind the song. But then I would get bored, and so I'd go on these little tangents. And I found some slash fiction that was about the police. Gay porn, a whole book that was written of the sort of fantasies about Sting and
I mean, you don't want to know my fantasies about Sting. I might get arrested.
So, I felt to produce a sort of a complete survey of the band, I had to incorporate some of these things as well.
Well, I mean, maybe to some of the character defense. So you have Stuart Copeland coming from a very powerful family with all this ambition. And then you have Andy Summers, who's already a veteran in the music. He played with Soft Machine for a second. I mean, he was a little bit in the avant-garde.
He seemed to play with every band for a second. But
he had been
written out of all of the history, which seemed to be a very big deal for him, obviously, because it took him until his mid-30s to
well, he jumped on it.
Get into a pop band.
Coming from Newcastle, totally working class.
Right.
Sees his opportunity and runs it. So it's all getting, it's like, what band on their second album is touring India? I mean, it's like, what the fuck's going on here?
But that's because Miles Copeland. I mean, look, Miles Copeland Jr., Miles Copeland Sr.'s son,
who's also gone on to be a massive record industry guy.
Right. I mean, he was the guy who was behind it. I mean, he's like the evil genius behind the police who would who would arrange these tours in India and wherever else.
Trying to add some exotica
knowing
to
they were
these
going to lose money
white boys.
Because there was no way that they could make money in these places.
No way.
But he could have photos taken that they could put into a fan magazine and make it seem like they were this world-beating band. Okay. So it was all to do with the image and the presentation.
And Bowie did the same thing. I heard Bowie didn't turn a profit until the 80s. Well, and Bowie bonds and all that stuff. I mean, I get that's the thing. And then there had to have been a lot of money laundering going on. I mean, because he did go.
Yeah, I don't want to go into.
Okay, let's go here, Chris. What music at the time were you into? So you're writing about the police, but you're obviously not listening to them.
What at the time I was writing that book?
Well, I mean, just you're coming out of London in that period. That What was the music you were into? Not that you wrote about.
I was.
Wait. There's a UFO overhead. Just hang on. I think they're coming for you.
A very conspicuous one. These ones are like,
I think they're coming for you.
It's like the old Winnebago. We finally got here.
Hey, I'm not saying I haven't been abducted. It was an unidentified frying object because I was in Joshua Tree where everybody's basically fucking fried. What music were you listening to at that, you were in London during the height of some of the best new music that came out of that period.
At what time? Like in the 70s?
Yeah.
I was pretty young then, so I mean, I guess...
Oh, so I guess you didn't get into it till a little bit later. I forget you are like 3 seconds younger than I am.
I saw the police when I was 8 years old.
I'm sorry.
And the opening...
It didn't ruin you, however.
The opening bands were The Fix, Joan Jett and the Blackhearts, Flock of Seagulls, but they had one...
I mean, I think that says everything, doesn't it?
Hold on, because it was in Chicago. They had to have one local band, and it was Ministry was the opener of the whole thing.
Oh, some of my worst... You just named almost all of my least favorite bands on the planet. How much rock writing did you do? Because you pretty much went from reviewing some bands, writing a book about the police, but then you got deeper into journalism.
I never really thought of myself as a music writer, so I never really wanted to be pigeonholed in that way. So
what were some of your first assignments? They post the police book, or even pre? Like, how did you start writing for The Guardian, or Esquire, or any of the other places that you've had articles published?
It's really just like getting connections and pitching the stories, and I just had a story that they needed at any time. I mean, the first, how I got into newspapers was I went to go and interview Joe Coleman. He was having a show.
Joe Coleman?
Yeah, he was having a show in England.
We hope to have on the podcast. Yes. One of the best lowbrow artists who features, almost all of his paintings are about serial killers or him. He paints with a one-hair brush. Really elaborate art pieces. Absolutely brilliant performer, poet extraordinaire, Joe Coleman. Please look. So that was one of the first...
Yeah, no, I'd been a fan of
that.
That was a Daily Telegraph, but I'd been a fan of Joe's and just reached out to a lot of my journalism or writing is people that I've been interested in. I interviewed Hunter S. Thompson, Gunther von Hagens, who was the Body World's founder.
I love Body Worlds. I want to donate.
I don't know if you would, if you saw what would happen to your body.
Well, I have seen it. I've seen the exhibition a few times.
I did a story on the World Body Donor Day for Gunther von Hagen's Body Worlds organization, which is...
So Body Worlds, can you explain what Body Worlds is for those who haven't witnessed the exhibition?
Gunther von Hagens is a German doctor, probably maybe in name only, but he came up with a way of preserving the human body by plastinating it. So he would turn it into plastic, and he could slice and dice the bodies however he wanted.
Two of my favorite, by the way, I just want to tell you two of my favorite pieces in his exhibition. There's one called The Lovers, and it's two heads that are only the arteries red in the head.
Right.
And the other is when he plastinates and then slices thinner than prosciutto the human body.
Right.
I mean, this is beyond Damien Hirst, who also stole some of the ideas from Gunther von
he's
Hagen.
an anatomist, and inspired by...
After my own heart.
So in the States,
literally.
I don't know, because the bodies, I mean, this thing's been on tour for fucking 25 years. When I first saw it, it was at the Field Museum. But then it's in art museums. It's like not really clear. Like, is it science?
Did most of the bodies come from China? Or Poland?
Well, that's what they say, but so when I went to this.
Plenty of bodies there.
He has a factory in Guben, which is right on the border of. It's in East Germany, right on the border of Poland. It's like an incredibly depressed
town. Did you go there?
Yeah, that's where I went, and it was the open day for the people who had donated their bodies, and they were mostly older people, and a lot of them were East Germans, as Gunther von Hagens was, because they were, I don't know, I guess they had a different, they weren't necessarily religious. So
communist Germany, it's a kind of an amazing time capsule.
It was a pitch. I'm trying to sort of articulate this, but
why not have your body turned into art when you no longer need it?
Right, but the thing is that you sign the contract and you don't actually know what your body is going to be turned into.
Well, but who fucking cares? You're dead already.
I guess so.
I mean, well, Simon, the producer over there, he always has a funny joke. He goes, my goal with my biggest enemies when I die is I want my corpse thrown in their fucking front yard. And, it's like... I still want to go on tour. I want to be, like, stuffed, and I want to... On a hot summer day.
On a hot summer day. I want to be stuffed with a voice box. I still want to be on tour. I will not be silenced, even in fucking death. That's just me.
The Gunther von Hagens, there was a couple of things that came out of when I met him and spoke to him. One was that he's a hemophiliac, so he has a certain... kind of closeness to death.
Well, that's amazing because he's obviously working on these tools to even perform this.
Yeah,
and he could at any point he could just die from internal bleeding.
And then the other thing is that he was, I think you have to be aware if you're ever sitting behind him on an airplane, you have to be prepared for the fact that he's dissecting your body behind, while he's sitting behind you, because that's what he told me he does. He'll just sit in an airplane or something, and he'll start dissecting bodies.
Is he looking for maybe a new lover? I'm just asking.
I mean, I'm sure he's.
If you wouldn't mind a slight introduction, I mean, I would hate to waste this beautiful vehicle, or this hotel for many monsters, as I call my body. I would hate for it to just be turned to ash, but then again, I figure, you'll never find my body. But maybe because Gunther has it.
When I hear about these people that have these grandiose projects that are just a full life commitment, this whole basically cult of workers that were just dedicated to assist in this. And
right. Well,
the same way any great artist has.
I think a lot of the work is done. A lot of the work is probably done in China and places like. Yeah, there were a lot of allegations that he was getting bodies from China and Russia of
Thailand too,
people from gulags and whatever. In this town in Guben, he had this factory, and that factory was the biggest employer in the town. And there were these ladies that
sometimes art does pay.
People working there, they would you'd walk around the factory, and they'd be scraping subcutaneous tissues off these bits of flesh and bodies.
There's still hope for the unemployed.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. One consistent thread with and one big conformity of the human condition is most people try to ignore death. That's why our meat is served. They fear it. Well, our meat's served in these plastic, shiny containers. We don't want to deal with everyday dying, and yet that's why people kind of like, what's going on with this guy? Because he's dealing with the intimate reality of death all day, every day.
But again, I mean, to me, he's not presenting death in a new way. He's presenting life in a new way.
Well, there's a Connie Huxter element to him
Two
as well.
all great artists.
You know, I went to he did a live autopsy on TV in England, which was the first autopsy that had been put live autopsy.
And was there a studio
performed.
audience like clapping during certain moments?
There was an audience. Yeah, I was in the
look at
audience.
that liver.
In the audience.
Yeah, it was
Oh my
amazing.
God, look at the size of that liver.
Yeah, it was phenomenal. I mean, it was like an incredible. You know,
I mean,
it was like-
I think it's more a celebration of the life that is contained within the body than expose on death.
Mm-hmm.
It's what we are. And people, I mean, that's why, I mean, at one point, the Operation, they don't have this anymore, the Operation channel, I used to love that, but because I've had so many physical operations, I wanted to see the inside of the body. And of course, the worst thing I ever saw was the C-section when they cut a smiley face in your belly, take your uterus out, and pull the demon you've just bred for 9 months out of that, and then put it back in and stitch it back up. Ew, let's not go there again, thanks.
No.
All right.
So
let's go on from Gunter.
We're going to go on from there. And of course, you said you didn't necessarily want to get into music journalism, but you started a label?
you know,
Well, that's not journalism. That's historianism.
I know, but fine. But because you want to get it, because also you wrote other things on music too, quite a bit. And
yeah,
you
know, I
obviously
mean,
love
music. Yeah, I love music, and things came up, and you know, I was always looking for an opportunity to sort of write about things, and if there wasn't an opportunity to write about something, the label started because I wanted to write about a particular artist, and I couldn't work out any way to do that, so I ended up putting out the music and writing the liner notes. It was kind of that simple. And it was Mickey Newbury who was like, that was the first thing that I put out, who was sort of like a brilliant country music singer-songwriter, one of the greatest songwriters in America, really, at the time. And he wrote Just Dropped In to See What Condition My Condition Was
song.
In. And just these incredibly sad songs.
And you produce a beautiful edition of his material. Really quite glorious and elaborate. And again,
at a time when you
complete.
could still sell CDs, which you can't anymore.
Who else did you release on your label?
Well, you connected me with Weasel, and I put out
Connective Tissue.
There you go.
Put out Jack
Weasel Walter.
Ruby's reissue.
And Jack Ruby, for those that don't know, which was kind of the band that they ripped off in vinyl, Jack Ruby was George Scott, who then went on to be in my band, Eight-Eyed Spy, and the Contortions, and the Ray Beats, and played with John Cale, and died an untimely death. And let me tell you just how I met Jack Ruby. So I'm in New York. I must have just got there, and I went to Bleecker Bob's, which was a overpriced underground record store in the Village. And they were closed, and I saw really the ugliest man I'd ever seen in my life working, and I knocked on the door going, hey, do you got any jobs here? I need a job. I'm probably 16, 17. He goes, we don't have any jobs here, plus we don't even get paid that much. I'm like, well, what kind of music do you like? Let me in. So he lets me in. And this guy looked like a Skeletor. And he goes, you want to come over to my house? I had no friends in New York. I'm like, yeah, I do. So he takes me to his house around the corner from CBGB's. And there is one of the most beautiful men I've ever seen, George Scott. So here I'm with Skeletor, and then a farm-fat, fresh, black-eyed genius. And they invited me to go to one of the rehearsals. And it was Jack Ruby. Mm-hmm. And it was Weasel that reminded me, Weasel Walter, that Teenage Jesus and Jack Ruby played together. I didn't remember that. But I'm one of the
at
few
the Village
people...
Underground or something.
Yeah,
I think,
Village Gate or something.
Village Gate, right.
And I was one of the first people that just because of forcing myself into Bleecker Bob's, I didn't give a shit if it was the ugliest man I ever... I knew he had good taste in music. I didn't know he'd provide me with George Scott, who, by the way, George Scott, one of his talents besides playing bass, when he was drunk, he would be so strong he could rip a receiver off a payphone. And he did that one time too often and cut his hand almost in half, still continued to play the bass. Carry on. Who else?
Django Reinhardt.
Yeah, who else? Jack Ruby.
Well, Jack Ruby.
Via Weasel
the
Walter.
one that, when you talk about the threads, you know, I was talking to Robin Hall.
Robbie Hall was the singer of Jack Ruby.
And he told me that when he was in New York around that time, he actually bought John Phillips's drugs or managed to get, you know, because the pharmaceuticals were going around New York at that time. So.
And by the way, George Scott died of a heroin overdose. I had nothing to do with it, neither did John Phillips. Otherwise, he'd probably still be alive. It was a freaking tragedy.
Aw.
But Jack Ruby are an amazing. They were
post garage, pre-synth, pre-punk, but had a very weird. They occupied their own genre. I mean, there's no genre you can put them in, and very bizarre songs like Bad Teeth, one of their songs. Anyway, who else on your label?
You know, then the last one I put out was this singer-songwriter from the Virgin Islands called Scott Fagan. And, you know, just another thing that came through the John Phillips book. I was looking for people who could tell me about the Mamas and the Papas in the Virgin Islands, because that's where they were formed. They went down to the Virgin Islands, took a bunch of acid, and
wrote some songs.
I feel like that story's not even true, but
it's absolutely true.
It's like, here's $1 million.
So I was looking for somebody who could talk to me about that, and I stumbled onto this guy who was like a folk singer in the 60s from the Virgin Islands. I was like, oh, great, he'll know something. So I contacted him, and right before I spoke to him, I listened to his record, which was called South Atlantic Blues, and right from the first note, I was just blown away by this album. It was just this very beautiful Baroque folk rock record from 1968. When I spoke to him, he just told me this extraordinary story about getting on a boat when he was, I don't know, like 15 or 16 or something, going to New York. He had a phone number in his pocket that his mother had given him and somebody else had given to her, of someone who could be a producer, and he wanted to be a songwriter. And I think he had 10 cents or something left in his pocket. By the time he gets to New York, he puts the 10 cents in the payphone, calls the number. The guy who picks up on the other end of the line is Doc Pomus. Within maybe a few days, or maybe even the next day, he's being managed by Doc Pomus and mentored by Doc Pomus and Mort Schumann, and eventually gets a record deal. One thing leads to another, and he makes this record, and it doesn't really go anywhere. But it's a beautiful, beautiful record. It's about his life in the Virgin Islands, growing up essentially homeless, the child of two alcoholic parents, living in slums in Puerto Rico with his, where he's left alone with his sister when they're like 10, 11 years old, and sort of having to work out how to survive and subsist on their own. And it's about his rise from that sort of like poverty-stricken background into becoming a songwriter and an artist. He's still around, and he's still writing songs, and he's a phenomenal talent. And I was just very privileged to be able to sort of meet him and put that record out.
And it's fantastic. Did you meet Hunter S. Thompson?
Yeah, I went to Hunter's house in Aspen.
This guy met him too.
Oh, you did? Yeah.
Simon the Slasher Slater, our producer, also met Hunter S. Thompson. Here we go.
I'm a huge Hunter S. Thompson fan, and when I was graduated high school, my dad paid for my brother and I to go across country, and one of the only things I wanted to do was to go meet Hunter S. Thompson. And prior to that, I had read somewhere that he was looking for a new assistant. I very naively wrote him a letter like, I would like to be your assistant, and I told my brother, we have to go to Aspen, we have to meet Hunter S. Thompson. So we're driving around in this suburban, around like Snowmass and Aspen. We don't really know where we're going. All of a sudden we see this guy with a motorcycle with police shield and these yellow glasses. It was like right out of a picture, go buzzing by us. I knew that he was going to the Woody Creek Tavern. So I was like, we got to find the Woody Creek Tavern. We got to go to the Woody Creek Tavern. So we go there, and there he is sitting on this picnic bench with his, mail. I think it was like a Molson or a Labatt's and like a sandwich. And we're sitting table nearby, and we're kind of looking at him. And it doesn't occur to us that tons of people probably do this. And we like use our fake IDs to buy beers, and we're like kind of watching him. And finally I was like, I got to talk to him. So I walk up to him, I go, Dr. Thompson, we're the Slater boys. And he goes, Slater boys? As in Simon Slater? So he had read my letter, and I was like, yes. So he was super, super, super nice to us. He was very gentle with us. I told him that it was 1994 after Nixon had died, and I read his eulogy.
Which is
amazing.
Phenomenal.
And I said how much I liked his eulogy and how much my father hated Nixon.
He was so crooked they should have burned his body in a trash can.
Yeah, it was truly, truly great writing. We kind of need him around now. I mean,
absolutely.
His books are still around.
But
articles are there.
He talked to us about Nixon, and then he talked to us about OJ, and he told us this. I don't know if it was true that he had tons of TVs in the house so he could watch the OJ trial, 24/7. He takes a picture with us and leaves. So the waitress comes and goes, so boys, do you how was that? And we're like, really awesome. My brother's like, probably going to go up to his house and party with him later. And she goes, no, you're not. And we're like, well, what are you talking about? He's like, if you go to his house uninvited, he'll shoot at you. And but that was the story. And then because of him, I wanted to major in journalism, which I didn't. When I went to Indiana University, I had this awful teacher, journalism teacher, Cleve Wilhoit. He's started talking about Hunter S. Thompson as just drugged out has-been. Kind of raised my hand. I go, he's not a drugged out has-been. He's like, well, how do you know that? And I go, well, I met him. And so this guy looks at me and he's like, uh-huh. And so he used to have this thing called Coffee with the Professor, which luckily I never went to. But another classmate said, he's calling you a liar. So I go to the next class, raising my hand like this. Is like, I brought in my pictures. This is me. It's Hunter S. Thompson. That's my Hunter S. Thompson.
Yeah, well, similarly, I wrote him a letter and said I wanted to come and interview him. And he said, yeah, come. So I went to Aspen to the farm and spent a night there. And he was pretty amazing. This was like, I think it was about a year or 2 years before he died. He was definitely aware that things were coming to a close. You know what I mean?
He was coming to a close.
Yeah. I mean, it was right after 9/11, and I think that kind of really was the death knell of his
existence.
Hope for America.
Future, yeah.
I mean, he was. I think we were talking about it. He was always chasing the American dream,
right?
And I
which
think
was
that
a
was
nightmare and still is.
Well,
right.
I mean that.
Another connective tissue here is Layla Nabalsi, who took 17 years to produce Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas.
Mm-hmm.
I interviewed her
Right.
for Sex and Guts magazine that I co-edited and helped put out, that Gene Gregoritz wrote. And she's the one that told me to call Harry Dean Stanton, because I was doing a anti-beat. So the Knitting Factory in LA was doing a Beat Generation Week, and they called me because I curated a lot of shows at the New York Knitting Factory, and I said, well, I'm not into the beats, but I'll get Hubert Selby, who was anti-beat, writer of Last Exit to Brooklyn, Requiem for a Dream, etc. And Layla said to me, why don't you call Harry Dean Stanton? I go, he doesn't know me. She goes, just cold call him. So I call Harry Dean Stanton and say, hi, Layla told me to call you. And this is when he was doing his concerts at a place in LA called The Mint. He was doing music. And so I said, Harry Dean Stanton, I'm Lydia Lunch. Do you want to do a reading with me and Hubert Selby? He was the same age as Hubert Selby, didn't know Hubert Selby. He didn't know who he was. And I think Paris, Texas is one of the greatest monologues ever on film that Harry Dean Stanton delivers. So he goes, well, what kind of stuff do you do? I go, well, I'm like Bukowski, but more physical. Understatement. And he goes, all right, I'll do it. I'll read some Bukowski and some Sam Shepard. So one of the greatest shows of my life, I'm sandwiched between Hubert Selby, who'd been sober for 40 years, Harry Dean Stanton, who'd been sober not even for 40 minutes, and there I am, the Lydian Center. Oh, you're listening to the Lydian Spin with Tim Dahl and Chris Campion. You also interviewed Hubert Selby Jr., which is another connective thread here. How did that come about, or what period was that?
I think it was about 2000 or 2002 or something like that. The thing that I was focused on was talking to him about The Room, which was
a great book, The Room.
which is
well, I mean, he wrote 3 amazing books: The Room, Requiem for a Dream, and Last Exit to Brooklyn.
Right, but The Room is probably one of the hardest. It's probably the only book that I've ever read that made me feel physically sick while I was reading it.
Requiem for a Dream gave me almost a nervous breakdown.
Right.
The film as well, which is great.
So I was talking to him about how he wrote The Room, and especially how he wrote the dog training sequence, if you remember the dog training sequence in The Room. I think he told me he had a basic rule when writing was what comes to mind goes on the page. And that really stuck with me.
It took him 7 years to write Last Exit to Brooklyn, and he wrote it twice, and he had a mentor for that. I think The Room and The Demon were written quite quickly. I don't know about Requiem for a Dream. So I guess it's the early 80s, and I was doing spoken word and had just met Henry Rollins, who had yet to read a book, but started to read books. And we decided to just find Hubert Selby Jr. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how we found him, but we knocked on his door. And I don't even know if we had any kind of introduction, and certainly he didn't know who we were. But I had to ask him, do you have any idea how important you were to my generation? He goes, no, I don't. I said, well, I'm Lydia Lunch, let me in. And then, Rollins and I took him on tour, which he'd never been on tour reading from his books. And we took him to Europe, and I recorded an album called Our Fathers Who Aren't in Heaven, which was Henry Rollins reading his stuff, Hubert Selby reading his stuff, Don Byama reading his stuff, and then I was reading all of their stuff in one of mine. Jim Thirlwell did the music for that. And then Hubert Selby wrote the introduction to my book Paradoxia, which was just, one of the greatest gifts in my life. Mm-hmm. Because he was, reading Selby at 12, so I don't even know how I found the books, but people used to read in those days. That was just like, and then when I decided to move out to LA the second time in the 90s, it was because Jerry Stahl I had met him, and Hubert Selby was still alive. So that's another connective thread.
Yeah, and I only spoke to him that one time, but he was very sweet and very self-effacing, and
a very kind soul. I mean, this is a guy that, at 15, going into the Merchant Marines, coming out with tuberculosis, I think he had one lung left. That's what you had to do in those days. There was no way to make any money. I mean, he was a poor kid. I don't know how he got into the Merchant Marines. And I think it was when he was lying in bed in the hospital for I don't know how long that he started reading, and then hence he started writing.
I want to touch a little bit on your writings on the personalities of black metal. Were you a fan of black metal? How did you even
No,
get
it was
into
just
that world?
it was just something someone had suggested to me.
What year? I'm sorry. What year were you?
This was 2007.
Okay, so well
I
after
think.
the murders.
But
burning down the churches.
Yeah, but Mayhem were basically going on their first tour with Attila Shazar, who was the singer on their debut album.
Yep.
After their original singer.
Yeah.
Oh no! Actually, it wasn't. You were on a
Finish
mistake.
that sentence after their original singer.
Well, no, it wasn't the
For those of us
original
not
singer
interested
actually,
in
but it was.
black metal.
There was a
the
certain,
dethroning, if you will.
Yeah, there was a certain number of events that conspired to.
And I think Tom Garrison was living down the street from Euronymous, and basically the word was everyone on the block hated him. Because he would come home at 3 a.m. drunk every night and crank AC/DC, so you'd hear it echoing down the street. And then when they found out he was murdered, people were like, even Norwegians are pretty compassionate. They're kind of like, yeah, okay, that's actually pretty cool.
So basically, I went on tour with Mayhem for a week or something like that, which was an interesting experience with like pigs' heads wrapped in plastic in the back of the tour van, which
heady.
We're kind of rotting as we were driving up and down Norway, despite the fact that it was the winter. They were still.
And what's I find so amazing about that in terms of like just transgression in general, and Norway, the highest standard of living in the world, the best social system in the world, and basically their transgression is like, I'm gonna pretend I'm illiterate, maybe not one-on-one, but just some of those guys were just outcasts.
True rebellion,
and just like. In fact, I will murder someone because guess what?
Because my life would... Right, I'd be so bored if I didn't.
Well, not just that. It's like, hey, here's your prison cell. It's a library, and you can walk outside anytime you want.
All right, I want to know what your projects are now, what's coming, what's in the works, and just tell us what's going on now.
Okay, so I guess... God, I got to think now. But one of the main things I'm working on is editing a book by a Esquire Life magazine photographer called Bud Lee, who again I found just through a John Phillips connection.
Explain what some of his photographs depict.
Well, the thing that I got obsessed with was a particular special issue of Esquire magazine called Evil Lurks in California.
What year?
1969. Actually March 1970 it came out, but it was basically about there was a survey of the occult underground in post-Manson murders LA, and this Esquire magazine photographer Bud Lee was sent down there to go and photograph all these freaks and weirdos in LA. That's what he did. And there's just these extraordinary photographs that sort of show that LA was full of these people. It wasn't just the Manson people. I
find LA one of the most terrifying cities in America because it's so la-di-da until you get shot in the head. Right. Or until the Night Stalker or the Hillside Strangler or the Black Dahlia Killer comes knocking on your door.
The brighter the sun, the darker the shadow.
There you go. So, okay, you're working on...
Yeah, so I'm sort of like, I've been working with his estate and his family to hopefully sort of
the photos
eventually...
are incredible.
Yeah, he was an extra... I mean, and the thing with Bud Lee as well is that I can relate to him in somebody who is like a working photographer who went from one story to another story to another story, and looking through his photographs, it seems like there was this connection. One thing would lead to another, and he would get stories that were assigned to him, or he would come up with his own stories and go off and pursue them. And so I can sort of connect with that myself.
And that's that's part of what this podcast is about, is how all these people from different backgrounds, different interests, different art forms, writing, producers, musicians, actors, somehow there is a connective tissue. And we don't consider ourselves this intellectual underground, but we've all somehow come to meet each other through other people. Mm-hmm. And that's really, that's the true tribe. That's really what it's all about, is you find
being, I don't even want to say minded, because we're all very different aesthetics, different tastes, different interests. But something has brought all of the people that you're talking about, you to them, and then us to each other.
Right.
I think that's the most interesting part of living as long as I have. I still have other people to meet. I don't know who they are, but I'm sure they're going to come to me. I want to just hear about the other projects. So you got Bud Lee. The Papa John Phillips book is still, it might be an 18. It might be like Selby said about the willow tree. It was the ghost in the doorway. It took him 16 years to write that book.
Eventually
you're
it'll come
halfway
to
there.
fruition, and I'll see where else it leads me on the way to finishing it,
And
I
that's
guess.
it. It's led you to Bud Lee and various other things.
Yeah, and how we started this conversation, it led me to the Graham Parsons sci-fi movie. It led me to come and live in Joshua Tree and then sort of explore all sort of different avenues of the history and the culture of Joshua Tree.
I forget her name, but who's the woman that you're working on in Vegas? Can you talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, it also led me to a lady called Lithofayne Pridgeon, who was possibly one of the most extraordinary people that I've ever met or come to be able to know, who was a girlfriend of Jimi Hendrix's from 1962 to 1970, was a girlfriend of Sam Cooke's, Little Willie John, Jackie Wilson, and just had this...
Is that the one that got into a threesome with Rod Stewart and...
No, she didn't. But Lithofayne
Now you're pulling at threads.
Lithofayne had an amazing life, and I think Lithofayne grew up in Georgia in a place called Dirty Spoon in 1940s, and somehow just was propelled and
gorgeous she was too.
Yeah, she was beautiful. She was beautiful, and she
beautiful.
was not a groupie. She just happened to be in the right place at the right time and
Like
met all of these
musicians.
people, and like music, and was a musician herself actually. And I feel, and I think probably I can bear this out, is that she was with Jimmy from very early on, and he wasn't really writing songs, I don't think, before he met her. She was into blues. And she was already writing songs and writing poetry and things like that. And
he
they
already
lived
been AWOL at that point. He was already...
Yeah. So they actually, and I think they had a sort of creative back and forth and a romantic relationship. And she was
before
just...
London, before he moved to...
that was before London.
Right,
Yeah, she was 62, 63, she met him. And she was with him up until 70, on and off. But she was with a lot of other guys as well. And that was something that Jimmy could not handle.
Oh, they never can.
Yeah, they were... Yeah.
Really?
Men so jealous, so insecure.
They have a
persona.
Yeah, they have an extraordinary story. I mean, she's got an extraordinary story. So...
You're working on a book on her.
No. I had actually tracked her down at one point because she ended up living with Sly Stone in John Phillips's mansion.
Oh boy!
Around the time of.
I mean, you cannot get sandwiched between two fucking out the wall motherfuckers and those two.
She went out with Eddie Hazel for a while.
Well, he was maybe a little less. Well, I mean, yeah,
but I tracked her down because I'd seen her in this Jimi Hendrix documentary from 1973, which if you watch it, and Lithofayne is just an extraordinary presence in that film. And I was obsessed with her from that and tracked her down, and she, we carried on talking, and I ended up writing a story about her that sort of, kind of went around and went viral a little bit. And, I've kept in touch with her since then. And but I just feel that she's a living witness to all this history that really, I don't know anyone else that is like her, because she came from the South, segregated South in the 40s, went through up into Harlem in the 50s and the 60s. She and knew pretty much everybody in the R&B scene and even into the rock scene,
and obviously was well respected.
Yeah, these guys, she was treated as an equal by a lot of these guys in a way that a lot of women weren't.
For sure.
And she was a fierce personality herself. A force of nature, and still alive, and still. When I talk to her, it's extraordinary. She'll tell a story, and it's as if you're in the room with her at that time.
Back.
Yeah, and so this is the kind of thing that keeps me going, and wanting to be able to tell these stories and to be able to bring these stories to kind of a wider audience. I think because the history that we receive is so sort of limited and narrow, and a lot of what I've been engaged in, I guess, is trying to expand that and tell the stories that underlie a lot of that stuff to really turn things that we know about sort of popular culture inside out.
And for someone as thorough as you know, because these are all filters, and when you do your research, and it sounds like she was a wide angle lens.
Yeah, there we go. You're listening to The Lydian Spin with Tim Dahl. We've been talking with Chris Campion. I consider him a great historian who just happens to translate that into journalism for books and magazines and newspapers.